In the last lesson, we briefly touched upon the idea that there are three different types of carbohydrate: starch, fiber, and sugar. We learned that while there are three different types of carbohydrate, they're all made with the same simple sugar molecules put together in different lengths and different combinations to create those different properties that our body uses in different ways. In this lesson, we're going to explore a bit more about each of these different categories and how they impact the body. Let's start by talking about sugars. These are the simplest of all the different carbohydrate chemistries. As we learned previously, single molecules of sugar are what make up every different type of carbohydrate that we know. Molecules of glucose, fructose, and galactose combined in different numbers in different ways to ultimately create things like starch, fiber, and sugar. Now, what's a little bit confusing is you'll notice that we're talking about and using the word sugar in many different ways. There are those single molecules of sugar that we talk about: glucose, fructose, and galactose. And then we also tend to use the word sugar to describe what's found within the food, which is 1 to 2 molecules of those simple sugars coming together in different ways. Sugar is also the word that we will use to talk about sweeteners, like the more concentrated kind of plant based things. We'll talk more about that as well. So, 1 to 2 molecules of these sugars can come together, and that's when we end up with the sugar that's found in food. We can have things like sucrose, which is glucose and fructose together. So, those are the 2 molecules within that. There's lactose, which is found in dairy products, which is glucose and galactose coming together. Or we can end up with something like maltose, which is glucose and glucose coming together. So, again, when 1 or 2 molecules come together, that's what makes up the sugar that can be found within our different food sources. Now, these sugars are naturally found within things like milk, yogurt, fruit, and even some grain products. When we extract it from foods and concentrate it, that's when we end up with like the added sugars that we commonly talk about, right? So cane sugar, for example. So if you take the cane sugar plant and you extract it and concentrate it, you end up with table sugar. Brown sugar is a combination of that table sugar from the as well as like some molasses. So we're extracting things from different plants and concentrating them to come up with some of our added sweeteners. For the most part, our body sees these combinations of the different single molecules of sugar as fairly universal. And ultimately, it turns any of them into blood glucose, which is then used as energy by our cells. There really is no best or healthiest sugar, but there are some kind of uncommon circumstances where the chemistry of these sweeteners or sugars might matter, for example. So, for example, there are people who cannot metabolize fructose. So, they may need to avoid any food that has fructose in it. And there are still others that can't metabolize lactose. So, they may avoid foods containing that. In sports nutrition, it's common to try to strategize the types of sugar that people consume to avoid overwhelming the GI system. But these situations are not universal, that it's not always very common. It really depends upon the person and the circumstance. And it's not necessary for us when we're considering our overall health and well-being unless we're in one of those particular situations. What can make a difference in how our body experiences sugar are the nutrients that are also present in the meal, snack, or just the instance of eating. As we've mentioned previously, it's rare to have a food that is purely one nutrient. It almost always is going to contain something else, whether that's water, fiber, fat, protein, vitamins, minerals, etc. And this is also where you might find people claiming that certain foods are healthier because they than others because they contain different nutrients. But you could make an argument one way or another just depending upon what your body needs and what circumstance you're in. Often these health claims don't really look at the full picture. They're looking at a food in isolation. A food is not healthy or unhealthy in isolation. as we talked about repeatedly, not all foods contain the same nutrients, and that's really okay. So long as we're getting the nutrients that we need over time and our body is getting what it needs to live in the way that we want to live, we're doing okay. So there may be times that we want and need foods with fewer nutrients. For example, if we need energy quick without all of that digestive work, we might want to choose a food that has little to no fiber, fat, or protein. There may also be times where we benefit from a more well rounded nutrient profile, whether from the food itself or combining it with other foods in that instance of eating. Our body is also not so fragile that we need to be perfect every single time that we eat. It's okay if we're in an instance of eating and it doesn't have all the different nutrients that we need or it's not perfectly rounded out. We are far more resilient than that. But the whole point of this lesson is to kind of help you understand that these claims about good, bad, right, wrong, healthy, unhealthy, they don't really make a whole lot of sense because we need to think about them on an individual basis based upon what we need and where we're trying to go with our overall bodily functions and health. Starches are the next type of carbohydrate on our journey. They are made of 10 or more molecules of simple sugars, of the glucose, fructose, and galactose. And very similar to the one or two molecules of sugars or sweeteners that come together, our body also turns starch into blood glucose. But because the chain is a little bit longer and of varying length, it can be converted into blood glucose at a little bit of a slower rate relative to sugar. Because most of the starch that we eat is found in things like grains, legumes, tubers, starches are also a pretty good source of fiber and protein, as well as a wealth of different vitamins and minerals. Fiber is another type of carbohydrate. Like starch and sugar, it's made with the same single sugar molecules, but the bonds are put together in a way that the human body cannot break down and convert into energy. So, as a result, fiber ends up passing through our digestive system largely undigested. In doing so, it adds bulk or kind of volume to our stool, and it also helps sweep out waste from our colon. Fiber is only found in plant based foods. Sometimes it's part of the cellulose structure of the plant. Other times it's the outer layer of the seed or the grain that we will call the bran layer. There are two types of fiber, but most foods have combinations of both of them. Some foods are just richer in one source compared to another. For the most part, there's really not any need to know which foods are richer in one source versus another. Sometimes we have to be a little bit more thoughtful about it in nutrition to support someone's overall gastrointestinal system. But for most folks, what really matters is having fiber, ideally around 30 ish grams a day. What is valuable to also know and understand is the value of fiber and when and how much to have. And that can be somewhat individual. For the most part, fiber is a beneficial quality, especially when choosing your sources of carbohydrate. So, having whole grains is helpful. Having fruits, vegetables, beans, lentils, nuts, and seeds, all great things to do to make sure that you're getting fiber in your diet and overall nutrition. But it is possible to have too much fiber, especially if every single food that you're choosing and adding has fiber in it. And it can also become a problem if we're choosing products that have a lot of fiber added to it. So they can add fiber to different foods to try to bump up the overall fiber numbers. But sometimes for people who already have a very fiber rich diet, this can put them a little bit overboard. Too much fiber can lead to a lot of gastrointestinal distress, things like constipation, diarrhea. It doesn't feel good. Too much fiber can also prevent the body from absorbing some of the nutrients that it needs. So, like all foods and like all nutrients, more is not always better. It really is kind of finding that sweet spot where we're giving our body what it needs, not going overboard and trying to always have more and more and more. Another thing to keep in mind is that fiber does not have usable energy for the body. So if you're in a situation where you need energy and you need it quickly, like you're about to go do a workout, or you're feeling really low on energy, or you're trying to correct your blood sugar, sometimes choosing something high in fiber is not the right move at that time. It's another important reminder that food is neither good or bad, but rather really situational and circumstantial. As we've discussed previously, it's not common to have a food that has only one type of nutrient present. Every food is a combination of different nutrients. That might mean different macronutrients or micronutrients, as well as the many, many different types of subnutrients. For example, even when we're thinking about carbohydrates, depending upon where on the plant the food is coming from, we can see a very different nutrient profile. So, vegetables botanically are described as like the leaf and the stems of a plant, and they tend to be mostly water with a little bit of like fiber, starch, protein. So these are things like lettuce, that's the leaves, spinach, that's the leaves, celery, that's the root. So you can kind of go through and think about like where on the plant does this food come from, and it gives us a pretty decent understanding of what the food actually contains. Fruits are the portion of the plant that contain the seed. They tend to be mostly water, but they have varying amounts of things like starch, sugar, and fiber. So you can think of these like blueberries, strawberries, apples, they contain the seed, squash, tomato, cucumber, those are all the fleshy portion of the fruit that also contains the seed. Tubers and roots tend to have less water, but more starch, along with some fiber, sugar, and even protein. So these are things like your potato, carrots, and turnips. Grains, on the other hand, are this is confusing, but they are the fruit portion of grass plants. So we're only going to find a grain and the quality of grains when it's on a grass plant, not on like a vegetable plant. Grains tend to have a lot less water than things like tubers and roots, and they tend to be a bit more rich in starch. They also are a good source of some proteins as well as vitamins and minerals. These are things like oats, wheat, barley, quinoa, just some examples. Seeds are a little bit different. They are the ovule of the embryonic plant. I know, it's a mouthful. They have more dietary fat, along with some protein and a little bit of starch and fiber. When the seed is found on a legume plant in particular, that's when you're going to get something like your black beans, your lentils, and your peas. They those particular types of seeds, or we call them lentils or legumes, tend to be higher in protein, fiber, and a little bit less fat compared to like other seeds that we find in plants. So all of these types of plants contain different vitamins and minerals depending upon where what you have and where the food is grown, what part of the plant that you're eating. Even the color can make a bit of a difference because we're learning that the different colors are associated with different phytonutrients that may have different health properties associated with them. That whole study we're going to talk a little bit more about later in the course when we talk about micronutrients. Phytonutrients are a newer area of study, but one of the reasons why they'll often encourage people to have different varieties of color when it comes to their produce selections to get all of those different phytonutrients and micronutrients. And what's also cool is that antioxidants, like one of the big health benefits that we get from plants, are really thought to be the plant's immune system that we are benefiting from. When we're talking about things like sweeteners or sugars in particular, like we talked about in the last slide, they are an extract or a byproduct of the plant. So, whether that is sugar cane, maple trees, coconut, or even something made by honeybees, but even then, the different types of sugar are not just one molecule or even a nutrient. Some of them contain water, and that may displace some of the energy that it provides. Some of them even have some other nutrient properties as part of them. What I really want you to take away from all of this is that every food is different and they provide different things that will impact our body in different ways. Again, that's not good or bad, but it's our job to be thoughtful about what we're selecting to help our body and mind do what it needs to do within the context of where we live and what we have available to us. It does not mean that we need to avoid certain foods, but maybe be curious about how they're impacting us and whether or not it's aligning with what we need and or how we feel. So part of all of that might be energy management and or hunger levels. Now, we are not talking about hunger here because we need to be afraid of it or try to control it, but rather just to understand that being hungry all the time can be in part related to the chemistry of our food choices and how much energy we are ultimately giving our body. So, first off, hunger is a sign from our body that it needs some type of energy replenished, whether that is blood glucose, amino acids, or lipids. Our body can manufacture some of those things and kind of bring the levels that it needs back up to where they need to be. But it also relies upon our daily food choices to keep everything stable and in the right range. Our body is constantly scanning our system to make sure that nutrient availability in stores are where they need to be. If it senses that something is running low, it'll send signals to our brain to shift attention towards food. Typically, our body needs to be restocked with energy every 3 to 4 ish waking hours, round about there. It can be there's some subtle variation person to person, but that tends to be the rate at which our body moves through and processes different nutrients. Sometimes an instance of eating can get us as far as 5 hours of energy being sustained, but it's really, really probably not going to happen that even if we have an extra large instance of eating, our body is still going to go through it within that like somewhere between 3, 4, 5 hour range. Depending upon what we eat, both how much and the types of energy provided, we might experience hunger sooner than that. So for example, if we didn't have very much total energy and or we didn't have enough of the different nutrients, we might experience hunger sooner. That's not pathological. That's not really a problem, but it can be very inconvenient if we can't eat because of our school or work schedules or food's just not available. And hunger can be really distracting and prevent us from actually being engaged in the work that we're trying to do or the school that we're trying to do. So, if what we're eating is rapidly digested and metabolized, as is with the case of like the simple sugars that we talked about and added sugars, we're going to be ready for fuel fairly quickly. But as we add more nutrients, not only they're not only more complex to digest and metabolize, but they also provide varying types of energy. And that helps to kind of satisfy our overall hunger and our nutrient needs. And that sustains us for a longer period of time. So let's get started on this lesson. We're going to explore the different type of carbohydrates a little bit more in this particular lesson. And then in our next session, we're going to dive into everyone's favorite macronutrient, protein. Stay tuned.